It's about 40 years since the world first became aware that something might be happening to its climate, that we might be experiencing global warming. And throughout that period, civil society has been playing a leading role in helping us to understand what might be happening and what could be done about it. It's been in the forefront of the campaigns to show what's happening to glaciers, to sea levels, to our daily lives. And it's also been at the leading edge of trying to demonstrate what we could do to reduce our carbon emissions through renewable energy, through recycling, through encouraging us to change our behaviour and our lifestyles. All along, civil society has hoped that through its influence, the big institutions of business and government would change their behaviour, that business would move away from profligacy and very high carbon-intensive activities and try and cut that waste, and that governments would introduce regulations and taxes and so on. And to some extent that has happened. The world, the economy is in a very different place to what it was 10 or 20 years ago. It's much more aware about carbon, much more aware of the impacts of our decisions on the climate. But in the wake of the Copenhagen summit at the end of 2009, it's quite hard to be optimistic, quite hard to be sanguine about whether enough will be done quickly enough to really reduce the enormous input of CO2 into the atmosphere, particularly at a time when countries like China and India are industrializing fast, consuming ever more cars, consumer goods, and so on. And that's why in our work as part of the Carnegie Commission of Inquiry into the Future of Civil Society, we looked at what civil society could be doing now to try and have the biggest possible influence on climate change, because this probably is the biggest test faced by any generation alive today from the point of view of the future. We argue for a series of actions which can be taken now by charities, by social enterprises, by cooperatives and mutuals, whether or not they're environmentally focused organisations, but to do their bit to reduce carbon emissions. Part of that means building up as fast as we can a truly low carbon economy, which has to mean a much more locally rooted economy with community transport, community owned energy, community food production and waste management. Done right, these can create wealth and jobs and reduce our impact on the environment. And this could be a way of building up community-owned assets for the next generation, rather as housing provided a base for assets at the end of the 20th century. We also argue that civil society has to maintain the pressure as an advocate, arguing for policy innovation to accelerate the shift to low-carbon economies. That may mean the occasional windfall taxes on carbon energy industries, may mean creating green investment banks, allowing new kinds of financial product like green ISAs and bonds, or encouraging regulatory reforms like feed-in tariffs, which make it possible for individuals and indeed communities to sell low-carbon energy into the grid. We need to be on the forefront of all of those arguments. And finally, we argue that, as in other areas, civil society has to be there to scrutinise what others are doing, to hold them to account, to show if businesses are simply involved in greenwash, astroturf projects which look green but aren't at all, showing which governments are really making a difference in terms of their laws and their regulations and their taxation, and using all of the instruments which civil society has at its disposal, from non-violent direct action through to research and advocacy, to try and change the way in which we think as well as the change in which we do things. At the heart of this, I guess, is a sense that we may be on the cusp of a possible shift to a very different kind of economy, much more local, much more sustainable, much more sort of rooted in our daily lives. But there's no guarantee we will make that shift. And unless civil society mobilises all of its powers, all of its energies, all of its assets to help this shift, then in 10, 20, 30 years' time, future generations will look back at us and think we really failed the ultimate test of our era.